This is Clearly Christian with Dr. Cy Smith, bringing light and giving voice to our country's single greatest hope while moving the culture to God's design. Our mission, to increase the census of those who live and influence society from a biblical worldview. The time for Clearly Christian is now. Here is your host, Dr. Cy Smith.
I'm Dr. Cy Smith, and this is Clearly Christian, a podcast about what it means to see the world from God's perspective, and then the impact that this has on training the next generation to live a life consistent with a biblical worldview. If you like the show, you've been listening, I'd encourage you to leave a review or hit the subscribe button. That'll let others know that the show is worth listening to, and that'll certainly help advance our cause or advance the cause of Christian education both nationwide and around the world. I'm super excited to introduce you to our guest today, Dr. Sean McDowell. He's one of our country's most highly regarded Christian apologists, making the case for the Christian faith. He's a gifted speaker, a well-published author, a seminary professor. He's a popular podcast host, and among other things, even still, teaching high school Bible every day to high schoolers, similar to what I'm doing here at MCS. So I have no idea how he finds the time to do all that he does, but we are super grateful that he took some time to be with us today on Clearly Christian. I know you're going to enjoy our conversation today. But first, let's go to school and let's set up our talk with Dr. McDowell today. Today, I need you to know more about how Christian education is uniquely designed to meet the needs of this generation of young people. Again, how Christian education is uniquely designed to meet the needs of this generation of young people. I've always personally been fascinated by generational studies. Perhaps that's why I've always gravitated to the work of Dr. McDowell and others who really specialize in reaching today's youth and this particular generation, how they're different from those before. Historically, each new generation has created change as they break with the previous generation roughly every 20 to 25 years. They will adapt their own identity, adapt some new priorities, create those new priorities, and they'll keep some of the values of their predecessors or previous generations, and they'll reject some of the others. And that's typically how it's worked, especially in the United States. But those days of slow, incremental change are just now gone. Sociologists are reporting that we're witnessing substantial cultural change now about every 5 years. And that rapid change is causing a completely new reality for especially Gens Y and Z, and in particular Gen Z, who we spend bulk of our time talking about today. Researchers such as George Barna and our guest again, Sean McDowell, note that the pressures facing this generation are unlike anything we've ever seen. The mental pressures, the social, emotional, even the spiritual pressures, unlike any prior group of believers in terms of the moral challenges that they face. Author Tim Elmore, who also writes extensively on generational differences and is also a speaker nationwide, wrote that 9 in 10 young people always use the word overwhelmed to describe their generation. We know they suffer from depression, mental illness, sometimes off the charts or at least greater than any prior generation. They're the loneliest generation, widely regarded as that, even though they're the most connected via technology. So we know some of these things, and you've probably heard some of these things about this generation. Obviously, we can point to the rapid decay of morality in our culture to explain the dynamic, and it's certainly not hard to trace it back to a rejection of absolute truth and this adoption of a man-centered worldview. No doubt about it. And that's certainly well worth your time and attention to look into that further. But I'm not going to explore that today. We don't have time for that in this context. What we want to talk about is what do we do then with Gen Z? Like I said, we know some of these things, but what do we do with them? How do we reach them? How do we recognize their reality, and then understand them? How do we love them? And how do we lead them to a correct biblical perspective? Well, there's 2 words we've got to remember if we're going to meet the greatest needs of this up and coming generation. And those words are truth and relationships. The secret to Christian education, writes our guest today, Sean McDowell, is unlike anything else, is this connection between truth and relationships. So that's really what we want to explore today, among other things with Gen Z. I know you're going to enjoy this topic of conversation. I know I'm looking forward to it, and I'm anxious to hear what he has to say. Let me close our time before I introduce him and just set up 2 quick chalkboard points. Number 1, If we're genuinely going to reach this young generation for Christ, then we're going to have to make sure we understand how they think, what they see, and how they feel. Unless you're in Gen Z, you and I have really a difficult time understanding the world that they face and the future that's in front of them, because it's nothing like what's gone before and the world behind them. And then chalkboard point number 2, Christian education is built on this connection between truth and relationship. Our model for teaching is anchored and rooted in a uniquely different Christian approach that unites truth to relationship, law to grace, and justice to mercy. So with that, as I say, every episode now, you know more. When you know more, you can do more. You not only think differently, but you can act differently, and you can say no more if you must. So with that, let me bring in our guest again, Dr. Sean McDowell. We're so glad to have you with us, brother, and appreciate again you taking that time. You extremely busy. Let me make a few comments from your bio here, which are impressive to say the least. A PhD in apologetics and worldview studies from Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, and currently then an associate professor in Christian apologetics at Talbot School of Theology in Biola, in sunny California. So it's probably a little warmer than it here is in the Midwest. And I think I have a friend who's a professor out there. I'll have to ask you about that at some point. Sean's listed among the top 100 apologists, probably globally, worldwide. He travels throughout the United States and abroad, speaking at camps and conferences and churches. And I first heard him speak at an ACSI conference. And it's kind of full circle, because I heard his father speak back in the 90s when I was in my 20s as a young Christian educator, had no idea what I was doing. But this guy up there was talking about moving from beyond belief to convictions. And boy, he had me. I was hanging on every word. And I think I quickly gravitated to Christian education after hearing him. Well, he's an author, co-author, or editor of over 20 books, including Chasing Love, The Fate of the Apostles, So the Next Generation Will Know, and that's one we want to concentrate on today, and Evidence That Demands a Verdict. A lot of you are probably familiar with that book that he co-wrote, the next edition, I believe, with his father, Josh McDowell, and that was hugely popular in our circles as well. And again, as I said, still teaches one high school Bible class. I don't know if that's every day or not, but the fact that you're just signed up for it and you're still teaching it to make a connection with today's youth, that's incredible. So thank you so much. I know you're squeezing us in literally between projects. And again, I don't know how you do it, but thank you, brother, for joining us today.
You're welcome, Cy. Good to meet you again. See you again, and happy to be on.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Well, again, thankful for the work you do. Reaching the generations with the defense of our faith has been your life's work. Just how different is then the reality for Gen Z? You know, you heard me say that in the opener, in this background. And so it could be a challenge even for some of our listeners to say, wow, historically unprecedented, that's a big phrase. Why do people like you quickly agree with that and saying this is a whole new ball game we've got to understand for them?
Well, before I answer that, it's important to highlight that amidst these differences and some of the unprecedented phenomena with this generation, we have more in common across every generation than we do differences. Our common humanity ties us together. That's one of the downsides of identity politics, and it just drives people apart with our differences. So we can't forget that amidst some of the unique challenges with Gen Z. And I think what really separates it, of course, is the smartphone. It's the truly first digitally native generation. So the access to information, the access to moral challenges, the access to relationships with people around the world is unprecedented. You can have what you want, when you want it, where you want, how you want it, changes so many things for this generation. Obviously, some for the good, but also some areas in which we have concern. But I think smartphones are literally equal to any just generation transforming technology we've had, like the airplane or paper in the past.
Wow, that's a great way to say it. And I think that's a good analogy for the listeners to really think how revolutionary, especially as a student of history, those things were, right? I mean, they transformed the globe. And I know you've traveled abroad. I've just done a little traveling abroad. And I remember when I went to a Latin American country and I saw all these stores that said orange all over the place. And I was like, I just don't get, what is orange? And they said, well, in the States, you have Apple, we have orange. And amidst tremendous poverty, everybody had a smartphone supplied with the, from Orange, who was their vendor of choice. So you're exactly right. Globally, completely different ball game for these kids.
Yeah, I agree. That's the unique challenges we're facing.
Yeah, for sure. Well, again, you're teaching high school Bible, so you're with these kids every day. So when you hear those descriptors like I used before, they're loneliest generation, of course, and overwhelmed. And when you hear things like that, and other words I didn't say, like pragmatic, of course, and fluid and social justice oriented, you see these. Do you see it play out every day in the classroom? And if so, what's it look like? I mean, for the person out there who might be in Gen X or a boomer or a grandparent trying to understand those grandchildren, or me trying to understand, even my own kids and the kids here at school, what's that look like to you every day in the classroom? Do you see that play out?
Well, we got to keep in mind that these are descriptions of a generation as a whole. And we could walk through each one of those in different ways. For example, social justice oriented is in part that they're being raised in a generation that just pushes this kind of idea in a way it didn't in the past. It's talked about, there's videos about it, there's focus on that. So it's on their radar more in a way than it was in the past. In terms of loneliness, we actually see across generations an increase in things like depression and anxiety and loneliness. But in some studies, this generation would describe themselves as the most lonely generation. And they're also at a stage where they're developing their identities. They're still growing physically, figuring out their worldviews. So some of these kind of factors will shape them more significantly in a lasting way than it might older generations. So in some ways, we have to be careful, because if you look at like the culture of a family, you'll have two kids completely different that come from the same family. Well, if that's true in a family, that's going to be true in a school. That's going to be true in a culture. So those descriptors are kind of hooks that give us an insight into what's unique about this generation. But we have to remember every individual experiences those and processes those uniquely.
Yeah. And could it be simply that, just to carry that further, that because of the smartphone and social media, we just know more about every subscription than we did before? So just the volume of data, and some of these characteristics could be there. And maybe we didn't know this about the silent generation, because how are you going to know it unless you passed out a paper pencil survey to those who were fortunate enough to go to school?
Well, I saw a study recently that said the amount of information created in the last 3 years is greater than all the information created in the history of the world up until that point. So there's just information overload, and that affects and creates anxiety. That can affect relationships. That can create a kind of skepticism. If there's so many smart people with so many different perspectives and so much information, who do I trust? And how do I know what is true? Those are some of the unique challenges that we see with this generation.
Yeah, outstanding. And we'll come back to that, because I definitely don't want to leave that truth point for sure. So as I mentioned, we're going through So the Next Generation Will Know. That's a study that we're going through with the faculty this year. Every Monday morning, I lead them in a faculty study, and we just march through a chapter. I love it. It's been great. And a couple of points, I'll highlight there. It was fascinating to read that 50 to 70% of those that we always hear about are walking away from their faith. 57% of that group are doing so before their college years. I mean, that was the first time I had ever read something like that, between those ages of 10 and 17, because I think most people, especially in my Gen X generation, we're quick to, and the boomers all as well, we're quick to say, well, it's college, right? If they wouldn't have gone off to XYZ school, then they probably would have, stayed with the Lord. But what you're finding in some of the research is, no, they're rejecting some of those things even long before that. So what are the factors in play in those young ages, in that 10 to 17, that so early in life they're becoming maybe intellectual skeptics, as you called it in the book?
There was just a study that came out this past week in Pew, and they showed that 10% less of, I think it was evangelical Protestant youth, are leaving the faith than a decade ago. It went from 66% to 76% are staying within the faith. that's not an insignificant increase. So and this is one study, you have to look at a lot of different studies. That's like 24% of kids who are raised in evangelical Protestant home will leave the faith. 76% stay. That's positive. And I'd like to think some of the efforts in Christian education, things that you and I have done in our different spheres, contributes to that. I think when it's all said and done, there's two big reasons why kids will disengage. But I think more than anything, it's relationships. And this comes from someone who's an apologist and a teacher and a professor who believes in ideas. But the largest study I'm aware of, and we cite it in the book that you mentioned, is 3,500 people, 35 years, 4 generations. And this is at a USC Vern Bankston. What they said is the most significant factor in faith transmission is a, quote, warm relationship with the Father. A warm relationship with the Father, statistically number one. And so that doesn't mean the mother's unimportant, but the father tends to be more of a wild card. That's just a reality. And so that really emphasizes that it's first and foremost parents that make a difference. All the data shows that, going back to at least 1972, that it's not Netflix, it's not Disney, it's not a teacher, it's not a coach. Parents are number one influence. But when parents get around them other Christian coaches and other relationships of people who model that faith, that helps for that faith to sink in. So if we want our kid, that's why we send our kids to a Christian school, and I've taught at one for 21 years, part-time and full-time, is I want the key people in my kids' life to live and model, exemplify what it means to follow Jesus. And the second piece is a biblical worldview. If young people aren't convinced that Christianity is really true, if we don't teach them how to navigate culture from within their Christian worldview, then eventually they're just going to be talked out of it, and they're simply not going to believe it anymore. So that's why I love Christian education. You have a chance to model relationship, but also teach how to think Christianly and navigate culture.
Yeah, great. Yeah, a lot to unpack there. And boy, you're speaking, speaking my language for sure. And you're exactly right, because we're telling families all the time, our school, like a lot of schools, we're not connected to a church. So, I'm not a pastor. I've got 3 degrees in education and things like that. But we're saying, listen, for us to accomplish our mission and to do what we do well, we have to be an extension of your home. And we want to be those adults who come alongside and are pouring into your child. And really, we're telling them it's going to take another group of adults, even at your local church. We really want you to get involved there and have teachers and parents and church members who are all pointing them in the same direction. It still will be hard. Even with all those adults, boy, it will still be hard because of all those cultural pressures that we were saying. They won't be immune from it. It's not a hot house, as they used to say. You're not going to find too many sheltered kids these days, pretty much anywhere. But we tell families in those admission process, and I'm speaking it on stage more and more and more, that don't think beyond it takes a village. Boy, it takes about every adult that's influencing that child to really form that relationship. And as you said, speak truth into that life. So yeah, I understand exactly what you're saying. Well, I love the idea in the book there, presenting 2 whys for every what. And I really challenged our teachers and said, listen, every unit, concept, whatever it is, it doesn't have to be every day, every period, but whatever big concept you're trying to get across in your subject, say, you keep that in mind, this whole idea of 2 whys for every what, because I think you're spot on in terms of this generation needing that. So can you tell the audience what it is that you meant by that idea and why it's so important to Gen Z, what you have found in your own experience?
Yeah, in many ways, this is true for every generation. I don't think this is just true for Gen Z. And let me go to a biblical example. So Paul, in many of his letters, will start off and give theology, like Romans, right? Multiple chapters about God's grace, and we're all falling short sinfully in the nation of Israel. He walks through all this theology. Now, by the time you get to Romans chapter 12, he's talking about, here's how you therefore live it out and love your neighbor. In other words, it's not just head knowledge, it's going towards how we live it out. That's when something becomes real. And so whenever I'm teaching something to my students, I want them to know the why behind it's true, And the why, in a sense, they can and should live this out in relationships. That's when it becomes conviction. So it's not enough these days just to give kids information and expect them to believe it. Well, the Bible says this, believe it. They want to know, well, why is the Bible true? Why is that good? Why should I trust that when there's a million other people saying something differently? And so, for example, I had a conversation with a student, this may have been 2 or 3 years ago. I gave a talk on pornography, and he came up, and he was probably a junior higher, and he goes, thanks for not only telling me what the Bible says about sexuality, but why I should believe it, why it's true, and why it matters for my life. I've never heard that before. Now, it's a shame that this kid had never heard that being in church his whole life, but this is uniquely what we can do in Christian education. Okay, what does Scripture teach? So that's the what. Why is that true? Why does that matter? And how does that apply to my relationship with God, with others, with myself, with creation? Then we're building convictions. They're actually living out in relationship, and they own it in a sense. So it's never been enough, and it's never been biblical to just tell people what to believe. We're called consistently in Scripture to be ready with an answer, 1 Peter 3:15. But it's especially important now in a generation that wants to kind of have a sacred secular split that says, oh, your faith is fine in your Christian school or in your family, in your church, but not when you think about politics, not when you watch movies, not when you play sports. They want to divide that. And Christianity affects everything. So in Christian education, when we are making those connections, we're literally empowering kids to live out what we believe in their relationships.
Yeah, great point. And that should be so easy for us as educators. If anybody should get this, it should be us, right? Because why else would I take this job? I want you to know this. And I'm not just paid to communicate or one way, spit out the what. And I tell our teachers all the time, anybody can do that. You can get that for free down the street at your local government school. So anybody can do the what. What we're paying you to do is the why. And you get to play the trump card, which is the biggest why of all, how this relates to something with an internal perspective. So yeah, that's well said. And like I said, there's that, we all know those stereotypical, why do I have to do math? Why does it matter? Right? Math teachers, they probably answer that question every period all day long. This is why you need to know this. Well, man, every teacher should be doing that in a significant way, talking about, hey, what's the biblical worldview perspective on this issue? So I love that part 2 there. And we should be getting that so easy in Christian schools. But it's easy even for us to say, hey, I got to plow through the content standards. I got to plow through this chapter. I've got to make sure I get you to where, the school or the state or this curriculum wants me to be. And I'm forever telling them, hey, listen, I'm not asking that some curriculum country or a company has the standards put in place and you jump through those hoops. That's not the objective here. I want you teaching what God wants them to learn, not necessarily what a curriculum company says, oh, this is in your best interest.
I agree. You mentioned math. My wife teaches math at a Christian school, and she gave a lesson this week. I forget the term of it, but it's like a bowl that's shaped kind of like a radar. And you see on the side of a football field how you'll have these kind of big listening mechanisms that are shaped like half a bowl because it takes the sound and focuses it into the middle so you can pick up what's going on in the field. And then she showed them how owls have eyes with the same kind of structure, which focuses right in the middle so they can see better, and then talked about God's unique design in the owl. I mean, that was like an incredible lesson that connects something on the side of a football field to something in math with God's beautiful, amazing design in nature. Those kids will never forget that. Imagine we're doing that day after day as we can with their students and making these connections. They look at an owl, never see it the same. Look at a tree, look at things in the world and think Christianly about it. That's what should set Christian education apart.
Yeah. Amen. Another thing we have in common, my wife teaches math here as well. So,
all right, very cool.
One more thing. That's great. This phrase, the loneliness of this generation stems from broken relationships. Yeah, tell us a little bit about what you meant there and explain. Does that explain, obviously, their trust issues? I mean, that's a big phrase. Like we were talking about, their loneliness is something they struggle with, but it not necessarily could be that just because I'm sitting on the couch on my phone, therefore I'm lonely. Obviously, we're talking about something much deeper than that. Does that contribute to broken relationships?
Well, I think this is true for every generation. So we were talking about Gen Z in the book, but loneliness for every single generation stems from broken relationships. What's unique about this generation is they have more access to information, but maybe less wisdom than ever. They have more means to communicate, but describe themselves as the loneliest generation. What's going on? Well, at the root of it is, I heard a psychiatrist by the name of Paul Warren, maybe 15 or 20 years ago. He's a Christian. And he said, an addiction is something that's used to fill a void that a relationship is meant to fill. An addiction is something used to fill the void a relationship is meant to fill. And that can be an addiction to bad things like pornography, or to things like video games that are not necessarily bad, depending on the kind of video game. When we don't have healthy relationships, we find relational counterfeits to play that role for us. And the hard part for this generation is they literally have nonstop ways to distract themselves and keep themselves busy from really confronting the brokenness that all of us experience, which is at the root of loneliness. I used to have my students journal. I don't anymore. And I once asked my students a question. These were freshmen in high school in a Bible class. I said, why do you think we keep ourselves so busy and just so distracted? And this girl, she said, I can only speak for myself. I keep myself so busy so I don't have to slow down and feel the loneliness in my heart. I thought, holy cow, number one, what self-awareness? But number two, a lot of social media, why people are constantly on it, is you just watch it from a different lens. It's a lot of people saying, do you see me? Am I important to me? Do I matter? It's a cry of the human heart. And as educators and parents, we got to recognize what's beneath the surface and address that.
Yeah, great point. Yeah, and I think you're absolutely right. If I'm constantly watching the world on my phone and I'm constantly interacting with things like that, I might quickly, immediately, even subconsciously, start to put myself into that world and into that place and say, yeah, where do I fit here and do I matter? Because I'm scrolling and this person matters, this person matters, this person matters for whatever reason. They've told me about what they're doing. Could be a dream life, or it could be just a headache, whatever they've decided to post about or whatever it is they're doing. And then I'm immediately hit with self-reflection. That's almost this state of human nature. I mean, one of my pet peeves is sometimes, when I'm having conversations with people and I can tell that they're processing what they're going to say instead of listening to me, or they're processing, how this applies to themselves, right? Because we're naturally selfish and self-centered. And as soon as you finish a sentence, they immediately come back with, well, for me, we immediately want to contextualize it. Well, it's no shock then that teenagers and young people do the exact same thing, only they're doing it with the phone and saying, how do I interpret myself in light of this? And I'm not just listening to somebody, one voice on the other side of the phone. I'm scrolling potentially through hundreds, if not thousands of people on a weekly basis to process all that stuff and try to figure out, where do I fit in?
Yeah, I agree. Those are some of the unique challenges of this generation.
Yeah, incredible. I'll have to mention that to my teachers, and we'll have to work through that. As well. You're helping me think through some good things. Well, as I said in the opening, I love that you call out what we do in Christian education. So I want to talk about that for a little bit, based on this connection between truth and relationships. And we've definitely talked about that a little bit, but let's dig a little deeper there. How do we as educational leaders better communicate the importance of that message, because I think, parents need to hear that they need to hear that's way more significant. And maybe you touched on it already, this idea of a warm relationship with the father, because that's certainly a huge example. But how do we just continue to drive that home to say, listen, you can't discount that. And you can't just say, oh, that sounds good. Truth, relationship. Yes, I want the most important people in my life to speak the truth. And yeah, shouldn't we have known that, every generation? No, it's kind of bigger than what you might think for this generation because of what they so desperately need and want.
Well, I think in a Christian school, it starts at the top, which is why I was so encouraged about what you're doing. Is I've told so many Christian schools, I say, if you want worldview to be taught, you've got to have somebody who values it and emphasizes it and teaches it from the top down. It's like a pastor in a church sets the pace. And you're doing that. So that's kind of step number one. Step number two, you said it comes easy to Christian educators. And I think that's true to a degree. But I also think a lot of Christian educators have not had a chance to go to seminary. They've not had a chance to do worldview training at the Colson Center. Many didn't go to Christian schools. Or if they went to Christian schools, maybe their Christian schools didn't do a great job of integration. So I think in some ways, I've seen Christian educators, when they're given the practical tools how to do this, come alive and get excited and do it. We just often don't give them the practical tools of what this looks like in the classroom. I think that's a challenge. And the other thing is we got to equip parents. We got to equip parents to do this. Like we talked about earlier, parents have the primary influence on their kids, hands down. So I don't do this anymore, but we would hold quarterly events specifically for parents, how to talk with your kids about sex, how to engage technology, whatever the issue was, regular training events for parents to equip them. So it's like the Christian school and the parents were coming together to partner in different ways to, in fact, pass on that faith to the next generation. And then finally, all of us have to model it. If we talk about truth in relationships, but don't model it, kids are going to watch what we do, not what we say. So I would regularly bring my family and my kids around the classroom, around the school. I wanted them to see me loving my wife and loving my kids and actually living it out in relationship. I talk a lot with my students about relationships with non-believers and how I engage them well, and sometimes where maybe I don't do it so well. I'm trying to model for my students and bring them along with what I believe God has called me to. That's how we have to view ourselves as educators. Is it's not just about math or history and science, although we have to teach those things. We're trying to teach students how to be followers of Jesus and what that means when it comes to math, what that means when it comes to science, what it means when it comes to history. Our job is first and foremost to disciple young people with excellence through their particular discipline. And so I could keep going. I could preach on this forever, but it starts at the top. We have to give practical ways for parents and teachers to actually do this. What does this look like? What tools do I have? And that's what we try to do. And so the next generation will know. It's like, here's just some real specific things you can do. And then we got to model it. And if we do, it's amazing. I think many kids come alive and really get it.
Yeah, you're exactly right. No, I couldn't have said it better. And having done this now for 32 years, I can tell you that every teacher survey we do, and I'm the president of multiple groups. I'm a state representative for ACSI and things like that. So I've been doing this a long time and talked with a lot of groups. And when you ask them about professional development, if not the very first, it'll be a close second, will be, hey, can you help me with biblical worldview integration? And it'll be from the veteran teachers as much as the 20-somethings as well. Because like you said, they'll want to know, hey, how can I make this more practical? What are some things that are applicable? And, we're quick sometimes to say, hey, listen, it doesn't come in a can. You're not just going to read a book and, a quick formula.
Exactly.
You're going to have to do some thinking here. You're not going to just, the Bible's not going to fall open to the right verse that's going to help you with today's English lesson, things like that. And definitely you're going to have to mature as a believer so that you can start seeing the world from that perspective. But there are some things that are already well thought out and well done, and we can train you. But you got to be, wanting to do that, and you got to go after it. And it's sorely sorely needed. But I also like what you were saying too about equipping the parents. I think another place that we're trying to really pour some time and effort into is honestly even our Christian colleges to say, hey, listen, we really need teachers graduating from these Christian colleges who have been taught biblical worldview integration and been taught how to do that instead of just assuming they're going to teach at a government school. And then, that is great for your biblical worldview, but we're not going to teach you necessarily how to set up that lesson well from a biblical worldview approach, because that'll take maybe some time away from the class that we don't have, because 90% of you are going to go off and teach in a government school. And so we've got to shift some of that thinking to say, no, we've got to start putting some real time, money, and investment into training some of those college kids who we desperately need, who have typically, those kids that go to Christian colleges oftentimes went to K-12 Christian schools. And so, they've had some time to work through a biblical worldview, and we need them to take it to the next level and come back and work in some of these schools. So we're talking about them as much as we are parents also. And I love that idea. We need to, I think other generations have done that as well. But again, the need is pressing for us to really say, listen, we have to help parents out there, because even our young parents, there's a lot of, I would say most of our school is probably millennial parents right now, right? Maybe some young Gen Xers that might have kids in the high school or something like that, but most are millennial, and they grew up struggling with some of these same issues. Maybe not to the extent Gen Z did, but definitely struggling to a point where, I've talked to many parents who say, yeah, I don't know how those 2 hours got away from me last night when I scrolled through YouTube or Facebook or something like that. And so, yep, they're dealing with some of those same things. So how do we equip them to come alongside those kids and say, all right, let's work through this here, maybe even together, and let's work through this relationship and the truth, and how do we live this out? So great stuff. I love that.
Good. I think that's the right question that you're asking.
Yeah, good. Excellent. Well, you're involved in so many things. As kind of wrapping some things up, what are you doing right now that really excites you? What are you working on at the moment? Because I want the audience to know, hey, if I want to know more about Sean and his work, and I think I don't know if I even mentioned there. Well, I did mention the podcast, but you have a YouTube channel as well. So, what are some things that you're working on? Or is there a book you're writing that, you think, hey, if you're interested in what I'm saying here and what we're talking about, or you're interested in, how should I really focus on the relationships with my young person? What are you working on right now?
So probably a couple things. I really have been enjoying long form conversations on YouTube. So I just talked with one of the leading laser eye surgeons in the world who grew up as an atheist in China, came to faith when he saw the complexity of the eye. He tells a story. I'm interviewing soon a former guard from the Iranian, what do they call it? Iranian National Guard, Iranian Army, who became a Christian. Have an expert on near-death experiences coming on. I find the most fascinating stories, and this is all to build a Christian worldview and just equip people. So if you search on YouTube, you'll find that's just a lot of fun for me. But I have a book coming out in June called End the Stalemate with a communication professor at Biola. And it's all about how to have meaningful worldview conversations with people who see the world differently. And it's a very unique incarnational approach to this. God takes on human flesh and empathizes and understands us. What if we lean into conversations with people who see the world differently, incarnationally, to really try to see the world as they do first? That's a powerful act of love and charity and empathy. And so that comes out in June. And I think a lot of parents will find tools just to talk with their kids and their friends and coworkers. So I'm about as excited about that book as any book I've written in a long time.
Yeah, that's exciting. So these people are going to be on your podcast. Did you mention that? Is that what you were saying about the worldview?
That's right. Yeah.
Oh, those are going to be great. And that podcast is called Think Biblically. Let's go ahead and get that plug in there.
Well, the podcast Think Biblically is one that's totally audio. My YouTube channel is video, and sometimes there's crossover, but they're actually unique. Next week I've got an ex-Satanist coming on who came across my dad's book and transformed her life. So if you want interesting stories, powerful stories to talk with your kids about, you'll find some really unique ones there.
Nice. That's great. Good for you. That's good. It's great how God's bringing those people across your path. Pretty soon, we'll see Think Biblically in your podcast overtaking the Joe Rogan Experience.
Yeah, I don't know about that, but my guest I'm posting soon first talked about Jesus on the Joe Rogan podcast. Interestingly enough, I'm releasing that in a few days. But anyways, just got to be faithful, plug away my job and your job, and leave the results to God.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. Well, again, thank you so much. And again, if you want to know more, if you're watching or listening about Sean and his work, like he said, there's the YouTube channel, there's the podcast. I'm sure it's, what is it, SeanMcDowell.org?
That's my website. Yep, you'll find it there.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So you can connect there and follow along. Book coming out, End the Stalemate. That's going to be great. Again, I'm not sure how you're finding time to do all those things, but we are better people because you're doing it. And we are better Christians and we're a better country. So keep up the good work, brother. We certainly appreciate all that you're doing. And we're going to pray for your health and strength and stamina and continued wisdom. And so glad that you chose to go this direction with your life.
I appreciate the encouragement. We are all in this together.
Well, thank you. Well, thank you again for joining me today on our Clearly Christian podcast. And I trust that now you know more and you understand how Christian education is uniquely designed to meet the educational needs or meet the worldview needs of this next generation of young people. Again, if you like the show and you follow along, I'd encourage you to leave a review, hit the subscribe button, let others know the show is worth listening to. And I'd love for you to do that for us. And that'll continue to advance not only this ministry, but of course, the ministry of our guest today as well. And you heard him say, well, all those things that he's a part of. And those are great efforts to obviously reach the next generation and reach those who can influence the next generation and perhaps to motivate each one to not only speak the truth, but get involved in those relationships and bring this next generation along because they need each one of us, no matter what generation you are a part of. Remember, as I always say every week when we close or every show when we close, the only way we're going to turn things around in this country is to increase the number of people who hold the biblical worldview. And as Sean said, live that out then every day. And the greatest hope that we have to do that is Christian education at home or in Christian schools. Again, I'm Dr. Cy Smith with Clearly Christian. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you for listening to the Clearly Christian podcast with Dr. Cy Smith. Hear more episodes at clearlychristianeducation.com. If you'd like more information about Christian education in your neighborhood, or if you're interested in education opportunities at Mansfield Christian School, or if you agree with Dr. Smith and want to help him in his mission to influence and awaken Christian America, you can send Dr. Smith an email through the clearlychristianeducation.com website. Message him on the Clearly Christian LinkedIn or Facebook page, or call the Clearly Christian Connection line at 419-756-5651. This has been the Clearly Christian podcast with Dr. Cy Smith on clearlychristianeducation.com, brought to you in conjunction with Mansfield Christian School, a Bryan Media production.